This is Time and Other Thieves, reflections and conversations on the nature of existence. This episode originally aired in radio format on December 1st, 2022. I'm Sarah B., and today, for this final episode of the radio show, although I will still probably make the occasional podcast installment, I'm going to explore some of the ideas that Stephen Levine presents in his 1982 book, Who Dies? An investigation of conscious living and conscious dying. Since Time and Other Thieves is dying in a way, I thought it would be fitting to talk about death today. Much to my surprise, this is the first episode, the first out of 74, that I've devoted to this topic. The one I did on the book Meditations by the Roman emperor-philosopher Marcus Aurelius was almost entirely about death. But that particular book doesn't have death in its title, and it touches on a lot of other aspects of the human condition. I could also say the latter of Who Dies, though, because one cannot talk about death without exploring the many complexities of life itself. As I mentioned at the end of last week's episode, when first considering which book to focus on today, I was torn between Kathleen Dowling Singh's The Grace in Dying and Ernest Becker's The Denial of Death. But then I saw Stephen Levine's book right next to those on my shelf and realized that was the text I should use. The other two are quite heady and dense, with Singh going pretty deep, if memory serves me, into transpersonal psychology stuff, and Becker into the far reaches of psychoanalytical thought. I highly recommend both books, but for this final episode, I wanted to be able to read a text in its entirety, and I worried that the intellectual rigor of the other two might make that too challenging and stressful. The Levine text is simply easier to read, and it doesn't sacrifice intelligence for accessibility. I first heard about all three books while in conversation with my husband's cousin, Laura McBain, whom I had as a guest on Time and Other Thieves at around this time last year, to talk about her work as a hospice chaplain. About a year before interviewing Laura for that episode, I'd contacted her via email to see if she could tell me about the path she took to become a hospice chaplain. That was a few months into the COVID pandemic, a crisis that had strengthened my already burgeoning interest in death and dying. Laura and I had a phone conversation, and she sent me a list of book titles to check out, 3 of which were The Grace in Dying, The Denial of Death, and Who Dies? Reading these and other texts inspired me to sign up for an online death doula training through the International End-of-Life Doula Association, an 8-week Zoom-based program that I completed in the fall of 2021. I learned a lot from the training, including that I didn't actually want to be a death doula, but I do intend to be present for the deaths of loved ones whenever circumstances allow, and I'd like to help therapy clients through grief experiences and fear of death issues, and to give lectures on the topic and generally be a calm voice of reason to counter the all-too-typical message we usually receive about death, namely that it's the enemy. This episode is one way that I can help disseminate the message that death is safe, totally ordinary, and nothing to be afraid of. When we fear death, we fear life. Stephen Levine was a longtime friend of American spiritual teacher and countercultural icon Ram Dass, whose book Be Here Now I devoted an episode to back in May. Ram Dass and Levine collaborated on books and co-facilitated conscious dying retreats. They also shared a guru in Neem Karoli Baba. Levine is one of a generation of pioneering teachers who have made the teachings of Theravada Buddhism more widely available to students in the West. He also worked extensively with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, famous for identifying the 5 stages of grief that people too often interpret in an overly linear way. At the time of the publication of Who Dies, Levine was the director of the Hanuman Foundation Dying Project, which he founded, and he acted as a consultant to many hospitals and meditation groups throughout the country. He himself died in January of 2016 after a long illness at the age of 78. He was survived by his wife and writing partner, Andrea, and their son, Noah. Andrea's name does not appear on the cover of Who Dies, but Levine dedicates the book to her, saying that she worked page by page with him on the manuscript and that her love, quote, reminds me again and again to let go of the mind and die into the heart. For over 34 years, Stephen and Andrea counseled concentration camp survivors and their children, Vietnam War veterans, and victims of sexual abuse. Although Stephen acknowledged that personal experience of grief is perhaps at its most intense when a loved one dies, he also drew our attention to grief's more subtle incarnations. Our ordinary, everyday grief accumulates as a response to the burdens of disappointments and disillusionment, the loss of trust and confidence that follows the increasingly less satisfactory arch of our lives, he said. In order to avoid feeling this grief, we armor our hearts, which leads to a gradual deadening of our experience of the world. The book, Who Dies, has been described as a central resource of the conscious dying movement and as one of the key New Age texts on dying. As its title suggests, Who Dies deals a lot with the concept of identity. We all move through life with certain ideas of who we are and how the world is supposed to be. Levine insists that each concept becomes a bar that blocks the reception of the truth. Each idea of how things are limits our ability to experience them as they really may be. We perceive death as the thing that will erase the construct that we've come to call me or I, and we set about doing everything we can to prevent that erasure. But, quote, the more we attempt to protect this idea of I, the less we experience anything beyond that concept. This bears repeating. The more we attempt to protect this idea of I, the less we experience anything beyond that concept. This is how, quote, our fear of death is directly equatable to our fear of life. When we perceive ourselves as a solid, static thing, we are on some deep level already dead, because the truth of the matter is that we, like the rest of life, are a constantly changing flow. Quote, moment to moment, who we think we are is born and dies, end quote. And so in the actual moment of death, when our hearts stop beating and our neurons stop firing, who does die? One of the primary ways that we reinforce our concept of I is by identifying with our emotions. This identification is baked right into the way we talk. We say things like, I'm angry and I'm depressed. But actually, we are the space in which that anger and depression arise. Levine points out that identifying with anything, be it our thoughts, our emotions, another person, is a surefire way to learn nothing about that thing, to gain no meaningful understanding of it. Whenever you call anything I, he says, that's where you stop. When we become aware that we are not the thing we're identifying with, but the space that all of it is floating in, we're better able to connect with some essential part of ourselves. And the more we cultivate that connection, a connection to the truth, the less distracted or influenced by life's vicissitudes we'll be. Not even terrible pain or our own impending death can sever us from the truth. This connection, Levine says, is something that all of us must cultivate right now. There's no other moment, he says, to begin preparing for death. To appreciate how much you might be in need of such preparation, consider how often it can be difficult, even when you're feeling good and your brain is sharp, to be present with what is. What Levine calls the latent tendencies toward judgment or fear too often take over and determine our behavior. We behave in ways that give us some sense of control. And that's when we're feeling pretty good overall. So imagine how hard it would be when we're really sick to resist our latent tendencies toward judgment and fear. Unable to resist such tendencies, we'll resist death itself. Such resistance indicates that unconscious forces are running the show. Do we want to experience our final months, days, hours, minutes, even seconds, depending on the nature of our death, be it a slow but persistent illness or a bullet in the brain, on some unconscious plane, recoiling from reality? Or do we want to die consciously? If you choose the latter, of course, that means you've got to live consciously. Levine writes, "When you start using death as a means of focusing on life, then everything becomes just as it is, just this moment, an extraordinary opportunity to be really alive." But the real poetry in all of this lies in the curious fact that in preparing for death, we're ultimately preparing for the unknown. And how can you prepare for the unknown? The only way to do that is to practice acceptance of anything that happens. Resist nothing. This doesn't mean we let people enslave us or abuse us or what have you. We definitely do what we can to assert and defend ourselves when needed. But that's not the kind of resistance I'm talking about. I'm talking about a state of mind whose motto is something like, "Only happy if things go my way." But things aren't supposed to go your way. Not all the time. Not even close to all the time. This is a fundamental truth that we humans have a really hard time grasping. I am no exception. When something bad or inconvenient happens, I get irritated because that something isn't supposed to be there. It's messing everything up. But that line of thought suggests that there is a way things are supposed to be. And that way just so happens to be the one that I concocted with my thoughts. Coincidence? Of course not. I'm delusional about life. This is what the Buddhists are talking about when they say that if you are suffering, it's because you aren't seeing things as they really are. I think Anthony DeMello, a Jesuit priest, said that too. I talked about him in his book Awareness on the very first episode of Time and Other Thieves. And here we are now on the 74th. Would have been number 75 if not for that one episode very early on Erich Fromm's The Art of Loving. That didn't air for some mysterious reason, and so it aired the next week. 75 is certainly more satisfying as a number compared to 74, but it also seems perfectly imperfect for the likes of this show, not one single episode of which has felt anywhere close to perfect for me. None of them at all like they were supposed to be, according to my vision or fantasy. We think this way all the time about everything. The next time you feel irritated or angry or upset in any way, get curious about it. Are you just mad at life for not behaving the way you think it should? For not being easier, essentially? That's the kind of resistance I'm talking about. And when so much energy goes into that resistance, there's very little left for cultivating our inner life. We're so focused on controlling our outer life that our inner one dwindles and dies. Martin Luther King actually addressed this notion in his Nobel Prize lecture from 1964, which I recently heard quoted as an epigraph in the audio version of Norman Fisher's book, The World Could Be Otherwise, by which he means we are not seeing it as it really is. King put it beautifully when he said, "Our problem today is that we have allowed the internal to become lost in the external. We have allowed the means by which we live to outdistance the ends for which we live. So much of modern life can be summarized in that arresting dictum of the poet Thoreau, 'Improved means to an unimproved end.' This is the serious predicament, the deep and haunting problem confronting modern man. If we are to survive today, our moral and spiritual lag must be eliminated. Enlarged material powers spell enlarged peril if there is not proportionate growth of the soul. When the without of man's nature subjugates the within, dark storm clouds begin to form in the world." Dark storm clouds have been forming in this world for some time now, haven't they? While things have certainly improved on the civil rights front since MLK's day, there's obviously still a lot of improvement that needs to happen, and I'd say that otherwise the world has gotten worse, much more characterized by what King called a moral and spiritual lag since the 1960s. We now live in a world where mass shootings are a regular occurrence. This year alone, as of November 22nd, there have been over 600 mass shootings in the U.S. We are destroying one another, and it's because the without of our nature has subjugated the within. When this gets taken to the extreme, in a person whose temperament already lends toward extremes, evil results. No two ways about it. If your inner wellness is totally dependent on external ease, you are dangerous. If we are to live in a more peaceful world, we must all be better prepared for adversity, prepared and open, and willing to experience it, because that is part of what we were born on this planet to experience. Levine writes about a saying in the Sufi tradition that supports this concept. Quote, "Overcome any bitterness that may have come because you were not up to the magnitude of the pain that was entrusted to you. Like the mother of the world who carries the pain of the world in her heart, each of us is part of her heart and therefore endowed with a certain measure of cosmic pain. You are sharing in the totality of that pain. You are called upon to meet it in joy instead of self-pity." End quote. Those are the sorts of lessons our children should be learning in school if we must keep insisting that they go to school in the first place. All of those mass shooters out there are acting out of self-pity. They feel victimized by society. In many cases, they have been victims of other people's cruelty, but they've totally identified with their victim role, so they feel justified in causing great harm, usually to people who never actually harmed them. They have not learned how to offer their heart, as the Sufis say, as a vehicle to transform cosmic suffering into joy. They take it all personally, as something that shouldn't exist, rather than a major reason for their existing in the first place. They are not up to the magnitude of the pain that was entrusted to them. And a big reason they aren't up to the challenge is because we as a society don't talk about pain and suffering in this way. We're taught that if we are in pain, something is wrong with us, or wrong with the world, or other people. And sometimes pain is a sign that something is wrong, but not always. We'd all be well advised to shift our perspective on pain and see it as something that is simply part of being alive, part of all of life's sacred dichotomies. Without darkness, we wouldn't know what light was. Without winter, we wouldn't know what spring was. Without pain, we wouldn't know what pleasure was. We need all of it in order for anything to have any meaning. And we humans need meaning in our lives. Without death, life would have no meaning. So if you fear death, you fear life. Conversely, when you accept death, you can actually set about preparing for it, which is so much different than resisting it or avoiding it or acting like it should never be a viable option for us. And Levine says whatever prepares you for death enhances life. And how do we actually engage in such preparation? Well, we can reframe any adversity as an opportunity to prepare for death. Levine uses illness or injury as an example. If we can open to pain or sickness and see it as a teacher, quote, "it no longer reinforces identification with the sufferer, the victim of circumstances. It's just what is," end quote. And in its very isness, it's the perfect preparation for whatever might come next, a deeper letting go. Being sick or accidentally hitting my thumb with a hammer, Levine says, becomes preparation for the impossible, for dying, for living in the next unknown moment of life. Unknown is the key concept here. Our constant desire to know is what causes so much of our suffering as humans. We relate to the world from our minds instead of vice versa, relating to our minds from the world from which we are not separate in our constant becomingness and dyingness. Levine references the philosopher and spiritual teacher J. Krishnamurti, whose book The Awakening of Intelligence I did an episode on in September of 2021. Krishnamurti famously said, "The observed is the observer." Levine explains this mind-bending concept by saying, when we look at the world, all we see is our mind. When we look at a tree, a face, a building, a painting, all act as mirrors for who we think we are. Seldom do we experience an object directly. Instead, we experience our preferences, our fears, our hopes, our doubts, our preconceptions. End quote. And of course, we perceive our own selves through this delusional lens too. In his extensive work with people who were in the process of dying, Levine saw firsthand how much suffering is created by, quote, our models of who we think we are and how the world is supposed to be. If we spend our lives identifying with our doing selves, and then suddenly, or even not so suddenly, as is the case with normal aging, we cannot do the things that we believed made us who we were, then we become very insecure because we don't know who we are anymore. We can no longer take the stance in the world that we'd become so attached to taking. Our models of who we are, and of course who we think others are and how we think the world should operate, ultimately become prisons. Levine quotes a youngish man dying of ALS in the latter stage of the disease that even made it physically difficult to speak, who said, "I've never felt so alive in my whole life because, ironically, I see that I am not just this body. As my body gets weaker, somehow I get stronger. Now that I can no longer do all the things I used to do to be someone in the world, I see how unreal all those things were." Anne Levine heard many dying people express some version of the following sentiment: "I had to lose it all to see that little of it was worth having in the first place. Somehow there is more to me than I ever imagined." I take so much comfort in these words. Jesus Christ expressed something very similar when he said, "Whoever desires to save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." If you can't get on board with doing stuff for Jesus' sake, you can reframe that last part as for the sake of life itself. As a 40-year-old in a capitalist society, one of my top priorities in life is supposed to be earning and saving money. And therefore, one of my biggest fears is that I will somehow be denied a way of earning money and or will somehow lose all that I've saved. So it's very nice to know that if such a scenario should come to pass, it might just be the best thing that's ever happened to me. I might realize that the less I have, the more I am. And then, of course, the flip side to fearing loss or adversity of any kind is that we cling to its opposite. As Levine writes in Who Dies, most of the moments of satisfaction in our life are clung to, making a temporary heaven into an increasing hell. We fear that we will lose our short-lived paradise and crouch in the dark corner, denying the inevitable. Grasping at heaven, he says, creates a life of hell. In order to not create a life of hell, we must accept life on life's terms. Such acceptance means, among other things, that we must be willing to not know. Levine writes about the concept of don't know mind in Who Dies. He says, "Our minds are so full, we are constantly rushing to answer each question that arises. We seldom allow the mind to not know. We wish to answer the question and thereby stop asking, 'Who am I?' Most answers that the mind comes up with are just excuses not to go deeper. It is the mind's answers that cause confusion. There is no confusion in don't know. There is just the truth." Yes, the truth is don't know. He puts it differently later in the book when he says, "We cannot know the truth. We can only be it." Think about how much harm is done in this world by people who insist that they know what the truth is. People hurt other people based on this presumed knowledge, and they hurt themselves. Toxic thoughts, for instance, are so damaging because we believe they're true. We believe they are a reflection of something that we know to be true. But in the case of toxic thoughts and so many other phenomena, a big one being what other people think of us, we really don't know. We really have no idea. And we need to get better at sitting in the no idea-ness. There's actually a lot of freedom to be found in that practice. Speaking of freedom, I love what Levine has to say about that problematic concept. In a chapter called Letting Go of Control, he writes, "What many people call freedom is just the ability to satisfy desire. Many say, 'I want more freedom,' and what they mean is they want to be able to have more of what they want. But that is not freedom. That is a kind of bondage. Freedom is the ability to have or not have what you want without it closing your heart. Freedom is not to act compulsively on all the contents of the mind, to let the contents flow away and tune to the unfolding." End quote. Viewed this way, freedom really is free. People don't need to drop bombs or even protest in the streets, although the latter is certainly appropriate at times, in order for me to be free. The ultimate freedom is in non-attachment. In a chapter called The Thirsty Mind, Levine addresses non-attachment, clarifying that it is not the elimination of desire, but, quote, an active receptivity to life. When we practice non-attachment, we nurture our awareness of the pure witness of being. It's a spaciousness we cultivate, making room for any and every thought and feeling to arise and then pass on through. In some cases, of course, we need to act on a given thought or feeling because we need to function on the material plane and might sometimes need to defend ourselves or others. But I'd wager that a large majority of our thoughts and feelings do not need to be acted on and do not need to be resisted or feared. All the things we do when we attach to a given phenomenon. When we are attached, we are either reaching for something, grasping at it, or actively, though often unconsciously, avoiding it. As Levine points out in a chapter about pain, when we withdraw from something, we never get beyond it. When we can just let a thing be and let ourselves just be in its presence, we are free. We have gone beyond the beyond, as the Buddhists say. The skill of just being is not only invaluable when it comes to our own discomfort, be it physical or emotional, but also to the discomfort of others. In that same chapter about pain, in which he tells a remarkable story about passing a kidney stone, Levine points out that much of our pain is reinforced by those around us who wish us to not be in pain, those who have little room for their own pain, who find pain in no way acceptable, seldom encourage another to enter directly into their experience, to soften the resistance and holding that so intensifies suffering. Again, resisting stuff and clinging to stuff, it makes stuff worse. And when helping someone who is ill or in pain, we can't be resisting or clinging to any of their experiences either. In fact, according to Levine, we shouldn't be trying to help at all. We just need to be open in, quote, an honoring of the truth we all share. This is happening right now. We are here. We are not separate. If I feel myself as separate from you, I reinforce your feeling of separateness and thereby reinforce your suffering. Levine addresses a particular technique he used in his work with terminally ill people, wherein he'd talk to them from his heart or through his heart, silently sending them love and understanding. When communicating in this way, you are not asking a person to get better or be anything other than they are, though you may have a strong desire for them to do so. You don't put that desire on them. You just send them your love, straight from your heart. It's a compassion practice, pure and simple. Levine differentiates between compassion and pity by saying, when you're motivated by pity, you're acting on the aversion you have to experiencing someone else's predicament. You want to alleviate their discomfort as a means of alleviating your own. Pity creates more fear and separation. When love touches the pain of another, it is called compassion. Compassion is just space. Whatever the other person is experiencing, you have room for it in your heart. He goes on to say that people in caregiving roles experience burnout when they're motivated by pity or anything else that originates in what he calls the small mind. The small mind identifies with what we do, with our role. We are helpers. Quote, because the little mind, the little personality, doesn't have much room, we don't have space enough for the suffering of others. We feel isolated and struggle to keep from being submerged in our separate suffering. End quote. The way to not get burnout is to give from the source, to respond to a given situation from the heart, not the mind. We don't give from who we think we are, but from the process that we actually are. In this way, working with the dying is working on yourself. It helps you realize, or it helped Levine realize at least, quote, that it is not you who has to do anything. All you have to do is get out of the way so that the appropriate response to the moment can manifest itself. In a later chapter of Who Dies, Levine revisits the notion of getting out of the way. He attests to witnessing many a self-proclaimed healer be prideful and grandiose about their work. While in some cases the interventions they perform do result in a strengthening of the body, the mind remains weak and, quote, the clinging that has always obscured the heart is not affected or encouraged to dissolve. In their efforts to heal, some people are essentially trying to change others, to take something away from them. Levine says that the healer's priority should be that each individual directly experiences their original nature. And when that is the priority, healing becomes a lens that focuses the potentialities of the moment. Furthermore, any healing that happens is not something that any healer can take credit for. To say to oneself, I healed that person, is to further reinforce feelings of separateness, which is what, according to Levine, most obstructs the conduit for the healing powers always available in the universe. If we are attached to the notion of someone getting well, attached to that particular result, then we will limit the depth of true healing that might occur. Levine asserts that for many people, sickness itself is healing. He writes, "Some have told me they have looked their whole life to find a teacher or a teaching that would bring them into some deeper wholeness, and that at last it turned out to be their illness, that it was cancer that became the teacher, the mirror for the truth. For many, disease is the way back into life." We must be prepared for any possibility. I'm reminded of what Roman Stoic philosopher Seneca said, as quoted by Meister Eckhart in his Book of Divine Consolation, which I devoted an episode to last September. Seneca said, "A man should accept everything as if he had wished for it." It's a tall order, but so is life itself. So much is asked of us human beings. If we constantly resist any given challenge, we will suffer. And we're suffering, aren't we? By trying to accept everything as if we had wished for it, we prepare our hearts for any possibility. Levine says that it's only to such hearts that the truth presents itself. To accept everything as if we'd wish for it means that we are working in collaboration with the universe instead of being worked on by it. We are not separate from the forces of life. Each of us is the space out of which all things originate and into which all things recede. And to quote Levine further, "Whether it is separated into drops or not, water is water. Our life and death are the same thing. When we realize this fact, we have no fear of death anymore, and we have no actual difficulty in our life." It's important to mention, though, that if we make it our goal to have no actual difficulty in life, we will only prolong our usual suffering. Levine references, though not by name, Tibetan Buddhist teacher Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, whose book Meditation in Action I talked about in an episode from November of last year. Trungpa coined the phrase spiritual materialism in another of his books titled Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, which I've yet to read. Levine describes the concept as a pitfall of desiring liberation. It is, quote, "a longing for clarity or deeper experiences, which slow the process of letting go into our original nature. To be free, we must eventually let go of even the desire for freedom so that the underlying nature may present itself free of the mind's clingings," end quote. Being motivated by some goal we long to reach in the future can be great, is indeed essential to thriving on the material plane, but it simply cannot be the source of motivation when it comes to thriving on the spiritual plane. Such a way of being would indicate the kind of desire that Levine calls unfinished business. He says, "Whatever has its goal in the future is an incomplete transaction with life." So we must make like the humanist psychologist Carl Rogers and accept ourselves, and therefore life, from which we are not separate, as we are, in this moment, right now. Only by doing that do we change. And you know what? Who we are and what life is changing all the time. So to accept ourselves and life in this moment will mean that we're accepting something different in another moment. And, quote, "there is nothing in any moment," Levine says, "that obstructs us from investigating the truth." This is very Marcus Aurelius of him. He goes on to say, there is nothing absent in any situation that keeps us from our potential, if we can fully open to it. Another way to sum all this up is to say, as Levine does in chapter 14, the title chapter of Who Dies, liberation is not something you get. It is your inherent nature. In an earlier chapter, he takes up a similar thread, saying, the difficulty with our desires is just that they are too small. They are the desires of me and mine. They do not include the universe. They are a desire for what we want, not for who we are. The title of Who Dies draws our attention to a very important inquiry. When we say that someone has died or is dying, to whom or what exactly are we referring? To that person's body, which hasn't been the same from one day to the next since it started forming in the womb? To that person's mind, which is comprised of thoughts that are constantly changing and often contradicting one another? To that person's emotions, which can also change drastically from one moment to the next, dependent on external circumstances, which are notoriously mercurial themselves? If we answer no to all of those questions, what are we left with? That person's essence, right? Consciousness itself. And where does that stuff go? The stuff of life, when the heart stops beating and the neurons stop firing. Does it disappear? Accounts from people who have been medically dead and then brought back to life tell us again and again that it does not. They say consciousness does not exist in the brain alone. Levine asserts that the body depends on the presence of consciousness/awareness for its existence, though we have been given to believe that it is precisely the other way around. In a diary entry dated March 14th, 1858, Louisa May Alcott writes about the death of her sister Beth, an experience which would 10 years later appear in fictionalized form in her novel Little Women. Beth was just shy of 23 when she died of lingering complications from scarlet fever. Alcott herself was 26 when writing in her diary, remember the episode I did on diaries? That a curious thing happened, and I will tell it here, for Dr. G said it was a fact. A few moments after the last breath came, as Mother and I sat silently watching the shadow fall on the dear little face, I saw a light mist rise from the body and float up and vanish in the air. Mother's eyes followed mine, and when I said, "What did you see?" she described the same light mist. Dr. G said it was the life departing visibly. Departing for where, though? Is it like Fiona Apple says in her song, "I Want You to Love Me"? And when I die, all my particles disband and disperse and I'll be back in the pulse, which Marcus Aurelius said over 2 millennia before her? I sure do like to think that's what happens, and anecdotes like Alcott's seem to support that theory, but really, who knows? Or as my husband likes to say, because it sounds funny, whom knows? None of us ultimately knows what real death, the kind we aren't brought back from, actually is. It is the ultimate unknown, and that's what it's supposed to always be. I'm not interested in making a case for some deathless part of us, the existence of which would enable us to answer Levine's question, who dies, with a confident, no one. And yet I do feel confident in providing that answer, though for a different reason. No one dies, not because we're all eternal, but because no one really exists. Not, that is, as the fixed, separate entities we've all been conditioned to believe we are. The still common practice of dressing dead people in their Sunday best and putting makeup on their faces to hide the fact that their skin has turned gray is a prime example of how deep that conditioning is. Even in death, we must look as we did in life, with all the same trappings that we thought made us us. The very self-image that likely made one's death fear-filled and heart-hardening is upheld after the battle is lost, when it shouldn't have been seen as a battle in the first place. And of course, so much else of what goes on in funeral homes is yet more proof of how hell-bent we are on trying to elude the experience of death Most of us are deprived of the chance to be with a loved one's body after their spirit has left it. In his chapter on funerals, Levine says, "To be able to be around the body of one who has just died for 4 or 5 or 8 hours afterward allows an understanding of the process of death unparalleled in our experience. And too few of us are able to be present with loved ones as they die, which Levine asserts is the most intimate experience people can share. That's why he continuously sought out the experience himself. And as for the losses that come suddenly via car accident, heart attack, getting shot, drowning, or whatever the case may be, Levine recommends that you picture that person in your heart and say to them something like, "My friend, you have died. Your body is no longer a suitable dwelling for your spirit or your consciousness. Just look around you with love. There is nothing to fear." Even fear itself, Levine says, is nothing to fear. Maybe you heard the episode I did on September 2nd of last year, which featured a conversation I had with my dear friend Mike Thor, who in one instant on November 20th, 2015, went from being a strong, physically active 33-year-old to being paralyzed from the neck down. One of the questions I asked him was if he feared death. Mike said that he didn't fear death at all. What he feared was being scared when he died. If Levine had heard Mike say that, perhaps he would have quoted himself from Who Dies? "There is nothing to fear in fear. It is just a state of mind whose magnetic and seductive quality has drawn us away from the spaciousness of awareness again and again, has caused identification with our suffering. The only way out is in." With utmost respect given to the intensity of my dear friend's predicament, I don't think any of us can say that we don't fear death when what we actually mean is that we don't fear a certain kind of death, the kind that causes no fear to arise. I like what Zen master Yasutani Roshi has to say about fear. Levine quotes him in his chapter titled Letting Go of Control. "There is nothing to fear," Yasutani Roshi says. "Just deepen and deepen the questioning until all your preconceived notions of who and what you are vanish, and at once you will realize that the entire universe is no different from yourself. You are at a crucial stage. Don't retreat. March on." That seems like a good enough sentiment on which to end my radio broadcasted reflection on some key ideas presented in Stephen Levine's 1982 book, Who Dies? An Investigation of Conscious Living and Conscious Dying. You are at a crucial stage. Don't retreat. March on. We could say that of every stage of life. I'm Sarah B., and I've just got 5 minutes left on this final episode of Time and Other Thieves. I hope you know how much I appreciate you listening to this and any other episode you might have caught. It has been a profound experience for me making this radio show and its podcast version. I will probably continue to make the occasional episode of the podcast, but making an hour-long radio episode every week has become unsustainable, and I want to focus my creative energies elsewhere. Those of you who listen to my Artist's Way series might be pleased to know that just this Monday, one of my personal essays was accepted for publication in an online literary journal. It's small potatoes as publishing goes, but it feels like the universe is throwing me a little bone, supporting me in my decision to focus more on my creative writing and my dream of being a professional writer. It feels like synchronicity, which Julia Cameron defines as the universe furthering and expanding any positive change that we ourselves set in motion. I hope that you yourself will go forth in trust of the universe. I hope that listening to Time and Other Thieves has provided you with the inspiration to give such trust a try. If you feel like reaching out at all, my email address is sarah@ashevillefm.org. For updates on the podcast, you can find me on the Instagram account my husband manages. The handle is @SarahBSeeking. But I will say, One of the reasons I'm cutting way back on episode production is because I don't want to add to what's already a cacophony of voices vying for your attention. Sometimes the best thing you can listen to, if only for a few minutes each day, is silence. Listen to the sound of your breath. Sit outside and listen to the air. Turn towards God in that way, or whatever you want to call it, and know that everything is okay forever and forever, to quote Jack Kerouac. Kerouac also said, and I've quoted this before, "Listen to the silence inside the illusion of the world, and you will remember the lesson you forgot, which was taught in immense Milky Way soft cloud innumerable words long ago and not even at all. It is one vast awakened thing. It is perfect." Big thanks to Violet Ultraviolet for providing the tunes for all the musical interludes on all the episodes of this show. And biggest thanks of all to you for listening to Time and Other Thieves. May you be safe, may you be happy, may you be healthy, may you live with ease.